Far to the south of New Zealand, amid the coldest winds of the Southern Ocean, lies a silent island. It's a place where life simply doesn't belong, not plants, not people. Yet a century after being abandoned, something astonishing was discovered there: thousands of giant mutated sheep. Was it the work of one mysterious man? What really happened during those 100 years? You're about to hear one of the strangest wild sheep stories on the planet. If you open a world map and scroll all the way down to the far south of New Zealand, you'll find a small island lost in the middle of the Southern Ocean. Campbell Island covers just about 42 square miles, smaller than Manhattan, but it's battered by fierce winds nearly 300 days a year, strong enough to bend iron poles and rip off roof panels. Temperatures rarely rise above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Rain falls almost every day, and winter lasts more than half the year. The vegetation has been chewed down to nothing. The soil is hard as stone and so poor that even roots struggle to take hold. There are no flies, no mosquitoes, no humans, no large predators, only skuas, the scavenger birds that feed on carcasses. For most living creatures, this is a biological hell where cold and hunger rule everything. In 1810, Australian captain Frederick Hasselborough discovered the island during a sealing expedition and named it Campbell Island. At the time, no one cared about it. But nearly a century later, the New Zealand government launched a policy called the Simple Pasture Lease, meaning anyone could rent an uninhabited island, bring livestock there, and claim ownership for a period of time. That was when the dream of expanding agricultural frontiers to the edge of Antarctica began. The first person to take on the challenge was James Gordon, a farm owner from Gisborne. In 1895, he loaded 400 sheep onto a small ship bound for the harshest island in all New Zealand. Why sheep and not another animal? Gordon believed in sheep creatures he understood better than anyone. They adapt well, can graze on nearly any kind of grass, endure cold, better than cattle, reproduce quickly, and move easily across steep, wet, windy terrain. At that time, Campbell Island was covered in mega-herbs, giant plants found only on sub-Antarctic islands with leaves as large as a human hand, packed with water and minerals. For sheep, it was nothing less than a green paradise in a sea of ice. A few years later, the lease was bought by Captain William Tucker since the first tenant could no longer afford to keep things running. Tucker turned this desolate land into an industrial-scale farming site, building yards, shearing sheds, and bringing in 3 more ships, each carrying about 1,000 crossbred merino sheep, prized for their fine wool exported to Europe. He even tried keeping a small herd of dairy cows. In the beginning, everything went exactly as planned. The sheep reproduced well, the wool filled the warehouses, and by 1913, the flock had grown to between 7,000 and 8,000, more than the population of many New Zealand towns at the time. But, as you know, every empire has its breaking point. The land was stripped bare, the vegetation vanished, and the soil was torn apart by mud and sea winds. Transport costs doubled the value of the wool, while on the mainland, wool prices crashed after World War I. Each voyage took 3 months and made zero profit. Tucker faced 2 choices: keep going and lose money, or walk away. As you can guess, he chose to leave. When the last ship left Campbell Island in 1931, it took every human on board and left behind 4,000 sheep on the deserted island. But even that number was far too many. And as it happened, some of the workers were left behind too, the shepherds stranded in the middle of the ocean. With no supplies and no radio signal, they survived on canned food, rainwater, and the very sheep they were supposed to care for. For nearly 2 years, they kept working anyway, shearing, sorting, and baling wool. 2 shearing seasons passed, and they managed to collect more than 20 tons of wool. But when the rescue ship finally arrived, they discovered that all that wool wasn't even worth the cost of the voyage. They left the island empty-handed. Campbell was abandoned, and the sheep, once assets, became forgotten creatures. If in the Sahara you die of thirst, then on Campbell you die because of your own wool. Yes, you heard that right. With no humans left, no one sheared them, and their wool kept growing about 1 to 2 inches every month. After a few years, an adult carried up to 50 or 60 pounds of fleece, nearly half its body weight. Imagine wearing a soaked sweater all winter. That's how they lived. Many suffocated or died standing because the wool covered their eyes and noses. When cold rain came, the heavy fleece absorbed water, froze solid like concrete, and they couldn't move fast enough to find food. They never got up again. Season after season, this brutal cycle repeated. Only those with thinner coats, stronger legs, and better cold resistance survived. In just 40 years, nature did what took humans 10,000 years to undo. It rewilded the species in only a few generations. This process, known as a genetic bottleneck, happens when a population shrinks and only the strongest genes get passed on. The result was astonishing. The Campbell sheep became an entirely different breed. They mutated. Their wool grew thinner and could shed naturally like their wild ancestors, the mouflon. They developed longer legs and stronger jaws to rip up roots buried in frozen soil. They learned to give birth while standing, and their lambs could walk within minutes any slower, and the freezing wind would kill them. According to the island biogeography theory, evolution on isolated islands can happen 10 to 50 times faster than on continents. Campbell Island became living proof of that. From a dependent domestic flock, nature had shaped fierce survivors of the wind, a species that reversed domestication itself. In 1975, a team of New Zealand biologists unexpectedly returned to Campbell Island during a marine ecosystem survey. They weren't looking for sheep, just collecting soil and plant samples. But when their helicopter landed, they froze in shock. Scattered across the moss-covered hills were hundreds of massive sheep, their coarse wool rough as pumice stone, grazing calmly in the freezing wind. None bore a single trace of human contact. Imagine this, a species that normally needs to be sheared every year left alone for 40 years in Antarctic winds, yet still alive. As the scientists moved closer, they discovered something extraordinary. The sheep had learned to shear themselves using wind and rock. By rubbing against cliffs, they shed old wool in clumps, revealing a new layer of finer, drier fleece underneath. That coat was about 40% lighter, allowing them to move freely and avoid suffocating like their ancestors. It was a behavior never before seen in domestic sheep. When the researchers offered them fresh grass in a trough, the sheep simply stared and walked away. They no longer recognized how to eat like farm animals. After 4 decades, they had survived only by tearing roots from the ground with jaws as strong as pliers. They grazed from 4 in the morning until 11 at night, enduring 100-kilometer-per-hour winds, as if they needed to feed nonstop just to keep warm. One scientist wrote in his journal, "These are no longer sheep. They are creatures nature has reprogrammed." When the research team finally recorded footage of the strange sheep, the New Zealand government began to see the darker side of this so-called evolutionary miracle. Campbell wasn't just home to sheep. It was also the only habitat for dozens of endemic species found nowhere else on Earth, like the Campbell teal, the world's smallest duck, and giant sub-Antarctic plants such as Pleurophyllum and Anisotum latifolia. But after 4 decades of unchecked grazing, ecologists were horrified. 90% of the island's mega-herb vegetation was gone, the coastal plains were chewed bare like a desert, and seabirds had lost their nesting grounds. The Campbell teal, once numbering in the thousands, had dwindled to just a few dozen. The island, once described as a natural laboratory, had turned into a battleground between sheep and native life. In 1937, Campbell was listed as a reserve for endemic plants, and by 1954, the government declared it a World Heritage Reserve. Yet, at the same time, a painful order was issued to eradicate every sheep to save the ecosystem. A long steel fence split the island in two, the north for culling, the south for research. From 1970 to 1984, 3 major campaigns were carried out with over 3,000 sheep shot from helicopters. It sounded brutal, didn't it? A species that had conquered nature was now being destroyed by humans in the name of conservation. The press at the time called it New Zealand's first biological genocide. Yet, amid the gunfire and freezing winds, a small group of scientists couldn't bring themselves to let it end that way. In the winter of 1975, they secretly returned to the island through gusts of over 60 miles per hour to carry out what they called Operation Rescue Darwin's Survivors. With no dogs, no pens, only whistles, ropes, and their bare hands, they chased through the fog to capture 10 of the strongest sheep, the living legacy of evolution. The animals were huge, weighing over 200 pounds, and fought so fiercely that several men were knocked to the ground. Overhead, skua birds dived and attacked, defending their nesting grounds. For 2 straight days, the team climbed rocky hills, hauled ropes through the storm, and carried each sheep nearly 1.5 miles down to the boat. One scientist wrote in his journal, It felt like carrying a boulder that could cry out, but setting it down would mean losing a piece of nature's history. Those sheep were taken to the Invermay Agricultural Center, where the Campbell Island Sheep Genetic Trust was founded to preserve their ancient bloodline. Each animal was tagged, cared for, and treated as a DNA relic, a living symbol of Earth's evolutionary heritage. More than 4 decades after the rescue mission, the story seemed to have ended. But the fate of the Campbell sheep would once again break the world's heart. At the Invermay Agricultural Center, the flock grew very slowly. Because their genetic pool had been severely narrowed by a natural bottleneck, only about 30 individuals remained. Each was raised under strict conditions and regarded as a living record of evolution. Then, in 2017, tragedy struck. A group of thieves broke into the facility, killing and stealing 5 sheep, including 2 that were pregnant. It wasn't just theft, it was an irreversible loss for science and genetics. The farm's director, Tom O'Connor, nearly broke down in tears when speaking to the press. They didn't just kill sheep. They killed genes that exist nowhere else on this planet. Ironically, the meat of these animals wasn't even good. Adapted to subantarctic conditions, their bodies stored brown fat, a dense, energy-rich tissue with a sour, unpleasant taste. It's believed the thieves simply wanted to try the flavor of wild meat, unaware they were destroying the result of 100 years of natural selection. Today, fewer than 25 Campbell sheep remain, all kept in genetic isolation. Each one carries an ID tag, a DNA file, and a small pendant engraved with its rescue date. So, if you've ever wondered, can nature keep evolving without us, the answer stands quietly in a small sheep pen in New Zealand. Campbell Island isn't alone in its journey of self-evolution. The subantarctic region, stretching from New Zealand to Australia and Antarctica, is a chain of natural laboratories where isolated species have evolved for centuries in ways no one could have predicted. A few hundred kilometers from Campbell lies Auckland Island, where sailors in the 19th century once released pigs as an emergency food source. When no one returned, the animals began to evolve. Their hair thickened to more than an inch, their skin turned rough and black, and their bodies developed twice as much brown fat as domestic pigs, allowing them to survive near freezing temperatures. Decades later, when scientists rediscovered them, they were no longer farm pigs, but Auckland Island pigs, a new cold-resistant genetic line now studied for cryogenic medicine and organ transplant research. Farther southeast, Australia's Macquarie Island tells the opposite story. Tourists introduced rabbits there in the early 1900s for fun, and they exploded in number. By the 1980s, more than 150,000 had overrun the island, stripping away vegetation and wiping out nesting grounds for countless seabirds. The Australian government spent $24 million USD and 7 years eradicating them. A biological paradise nearly vanished because of one misplaced species. By contrast, the Campbell sheep could have been a story of rebirth. If they hadn't been wiped out, they might have evolved into an entirely new species, smaller, lighter-coated, cold-adapted, living half-wild. They would have stood as living proof of reversal evolution when a domesticated creature finds its way back to the wild. And that's the whole story today, a journey spanning more than a century, beginning with a dream of farming at the edge of Antarctica and ending with a lesson about the limits of human control over nature. From Captain Tucker's failed empire to the reverse evolution of the sheep and the tragedy of 2017, it all shows one truth. Nature doesn't need us to survive, but it always pays the price for our mistakes. So what do you think? If humanity disappeared for 100 years, how do you imagine this planet would change? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable yet true stories from around the world, because out there, Earth is still writing its own story.